Hey everybody, it's Argent here on this lovely Sunday. If you live in Canada, it's negative 25, I think, out. So I hope you're inside and nice and warm and not freezing to death. And I'm here with my friend, Classical Theist. Unless I have really low agency, should have his channel in the chat. In the description. So go give him a subscribe. He does great work and he's just a really nice guy in general. So it's nice to have you on, man.
Yeah, did I go out and come back?
I don't think so.
Oh, well, hi.
So maybe just for people who hadn't seen the previous one, maybe just briefly before we get into today's topic, tell me a little bit about your channel, what you're trying to achieve, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I started the channel, I think, back in the summer of 2017, and it just seemed, because I come from the perspective of being, uh, first and foremost, a classical theist, uh, someone couched in the ancient and medieval philosophical tradition within Christianity, particularly within Thomism, the thought of Thomas Aquinas, and it just seemed that that kind of densely intellectually rich philosophical tradition wasn't really getting much exposure among uh, not only on YouTube but in these kinds of more or less conservative right wing kind of circles. It hasn't
Right.
really been getting much exposure when I think it has. Uh, a, really an armory of really good uh, philosophically rich arguments to bring to the table and can serve as a rational justification for Christianity. And a defense of Christianity, I think, is also very important in these kinds of
Because
circles.
I think it's one of the number one things that just irritates me, particularly I think like and non-denominational and just kind of evangelical Protestantism in general is just a really I think it's done an immense amount of
It
damage
has done the much.
to
It's
Christianity.
emotionalized Christianity and it's really uh,
It's dumbed it
taken a
down a
toll on
lot.
its image, and especially
I
people in our circles who very much want something intellectually rich. They want something to be able to really believe in. And Saint Thomas Aquinas says, if you can't uh, attract someone by their reason, you're not going to be able to attract them at all for someone outside the system. And I think it's very true. So you can't rely on these kinds of uh, fideistic systems to defend Christianity. You have to go back to first principles, and that's what I'm trying to do.
so Sam in the chat says just something I really think is there is kind of an idea, this fake dichotomy that either Christianity is everybody can understand everything, everybody can read the Bible, all theology has to be completely accessible, or the other one that kind of the alternative to that is it's this esoteric Illuminati type thing
Yeah,
that like
yeah,
the Catholic Church is covering up and hiding everything. And when you say you need a proper education in order to interpret things, then yeah.
yeah. Well, there's definitely some truth to the esoteric element of it, in that I think it's I don't say it's a mistake for like ordinary Christians to read the Bible, but I do think that uh, popularizing the Bible in the way it has been popularized has, to a large extent, led to these kinds of silly fedora
Or
tier
you know what? If it's okay, I
attacks
just
on the
thought
Bible.
of a better
Yeah,
topic. Let's do this on modern popular Christianity and attacks on the Catholic Church, maybe.
yeah. That's really good. Yeah.
Okay, because we do get a lot of I do get a lot of questions about that. Um, Yeah, so I think, yeah, evangelical Protestantism, I think, did an immense amount of damage
Yeah,
because a lot of people get angry at me. Because I remember whenever I had a stream of people who basically said, I read the Bible and this is what I know to be true. And what were kind of some of the other things? Like I asked, they basically admitted to me that everybody prior to them in history was wrong.
yeah. Well, that's kind of that has a intellectual pedigree, kind of back to the birth of modern philosophy. With uh,
Is that a
Descartes and
nominalist thing?
an anomalous thing. Uh, I think it's come about in through early modern skepticism, which kind of cast an it shifted the epistemological starting point to the inner subject, and in so doing, uh, has robbed the intellectual tradition that comes before you as something that is epistemologically necessary to, you know, sort of take refuge under. Um, and that I think has trickled down theologically as well, to where and the vehicle, of course, came before that through Lutheranism, right? And that kind of has caused that to happen.
I think one of the funniest things about Lutheranism, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Lutheranism seems like a lot more moderate and reasonable than what like Martin Luther stood for.
Well, Martin Luther himself, a lot of Lutherans do try to distance themselves from Martin Luther, and I think for good reason. Martin Luther, I think, was too bogged down by his psychological inhibitions to really, I think, present himself as uh, a theologian on par with like Aquinas and even Calvin. Um, I think a lot of people rightly distance themselves from Luther the man. Um, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily altogether an easy task to disentangle Lutheranism from Luther the man, and I think
Um, let's
Lutheranism
go, Theist.
itself
Do
can.
you have the video open?
Uh, Let me get to that.
Okay, just because there's questions in chat, we should just kind of
Oh, okay. Let me take a look at
yeah,
those.
like answer stuff as we go. Just if a bunch of people are asking things. Just if you're going to respond to something, just read out the question because I haven't figured out how to display it on Hangouts, the chat. Just if people are watching this later.
Yeah.
So, let me see here. Um,
That guy talking
okay, so
about.
why don't we start out with the sex abuse crisis? Because I get attacked on that a lot.
Well, the sex abuse crisis. Uh, I never like to start from the standpoint of trying to defend anything that went on. I pretty much, of course, I think it's very difficult to actually have the knowledge of what actually went on, um, because I'm pretty sure we don't have the unfiltered records of who exactly was culpable in the higher echelons of the church, who wasn't culpable exactly. A lot of accusations about specific priests and bishops, and even Pope Benedict himself. Uh, but I don't think we have enough information to indict or uh, deem innocent any particular
Well, we know a
or
specific
many of the
group.
bishops.
We know like a
Yeah,
specific group of people who
I
carried
just
out
don't
the
see how
actual
it's.
sexual
And
abuse.
I like to break it down to the more fundamental point of. I mean, while it does present a crisis of faith, and to a large extent, and while it is very difficult from an emotional kind of psychological point of view. I don't see how it at all would put in jeopardy the truth of the Catholic faith. I mean, there's, you don't get, how do you get from point A to point B? Point A, the church is filled with evildoers, to point B, Catholicism is wrong. I don't see how you make that
This,
kind of leap. How
I
anyone would
don't
make
think
that
there's
kind of leap. But
ever
I mean,
been a claim that the church didn't have corruption problems. Like even as back as like there was
yeah,
lots of people during the like
the Renaissance.
pre-Reformation.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of what Luther was responding to was based on legitimate truths about what was going on in the church hierarchy. Uh,
Mhm.
so, I mean, you had, you know, the selling of church offices going on, running amok. You did have the sale of indulgences that was, and you had a lot of priests who were sexually promiscuous. It was just a mess. So, I mean, it's no it's no
So like here
yeah.
is what I thought. Okay, here's my understanding of it. Now, if I'm wrong, wasn't the traditional purpose of the Inquisition largely to be an internal police force?
From what I understand, uh, yeah, yeah.
Because
Uh,
I looked it up once, and most of the people they killed seemed to be corrupt priests or priests who like molested their congregation or took bribes or stuff like that.
hmm uh, well, I don't see. You can point to abuses like within the Inquisition, but I think a lot of people bring up the Inquisition to say that it's wrong in principle to uh, try to treat heresy as some kind of legal transgression, and I don't necessarily think that's true within the context of the time, because if you have a stable Catholic state that has been going on for centuries, I think it's rational to treat uh, an attack on the religious cohesion of the society as an attack on the society. You know,
Sorry, just
it
to get onto kind of the point I was trying to make. Here's kind of my interpretation of the sexual abuse crisis. There used to be more internal policing. Like I kind of feel if the Inquisition hadn't have been shut down, the sex abuse crisis wouldn't have happened. Do you
hmm.
think that's a fair statement to
Well,
make?
a lot of the uh, I think it is true that a lot of the abuses that went on in the handling of the sexual abuse crisis, from what I understand, was in part a result of um, attempting to follow certain psychological guidelines laid out by secular psychological associations that were going to give these people quote unquote second chances
Because
to
this was
deal with
very
their
common. I think people overlook it is like sexual abuse is more common in other institutions than in the church,
well, the
like in
church was
particular in
following
schools.
secular psychological guidelines
No,
when
no,
dealing
but I
with a
think
lot of
like
these
a higher
priests.
percentage of teachers
Yeah,
molest their students
I mean
than
that's true too. I mean, people don't realize that's a sexual abuse
you know why it
that goes
is.
on.
It's because they're like, oh, the MILF teacher is molesting the teenage
Mm-hmm.
student, and it's kind of hot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, I'm like I say that kind
No,
of facetiously, but I
I know what
also
you
think
mean.
that
Yeah,
is part of it.
yeah.
That it's like, oh, the old disgusting priest. But like to my mind, I think this is kind of my interpretation of it is they shut down the Inquisition and they're like, we're going to have a lot of tolerance. We're going to like, okay, so we were mean to gays before, but they can be priests now. Nothing bad's going to happen out of
Yeah,
this.
that's a lot big part of it because a lot of these abuse cases had to deal with the post pubescent, not the pre pubescent. For a
Like
lot of
all of
it was
them.
yeah, but a lot of them. I think the vast majority of them
I
actually
think
had
I
to do
read a
with post
stat that it
pubescent, not
was
pre pubescent.
95% males and
Yeah,
95% teenagers. It was like
yeah, it was
almost
definitely
entirely.
vast majority was post pubescent, and when you deal with
Mhm.
that issue, that is an issue of homosexuality, without a doubt, full stop. I mean, and so it's interesting to hear these people in one breath they will. Uh, lambast the church over that, but in the other breath, they'll advocate for allowing homosexuals to enter the Catholic clergy, and that,
Well,
so
it's like the whole, and this is just kind of a general logical thing that I see in society a lot, is let me try it, like an issue that a lot of associations have is I'm trying to think here. Like because traditionally the logic was you shouldn't put people in charge of children or youth that they're sexually attracted to.
yeah, it seems
So
like a
you shouldn't
no
put
brainer.
male leaders in charge of Girl Guides for this reason. You shouldn't put female leaders in charge of
Yeah, the
Boy
church used to
Scouts for
have
this
a
reason.
very a church used to have a very healthy way of mediating that principle with well when they had a clear distinction between the priests and the nuns, right? Uh,
Mhm.
that seems to be a system that ideally would work very well. The problem, of course, is that religious sisters have been all but disintegrated, or
Yeah.
you, you don't have that kind of stable, ongoing uh, class of nuns anymore as you did back then. You have homosexual clergy running amok, and so it's all very
Well,
uh,
because like once again, and I remember that this happened with the Boy Scouts. Is they were like, okay, we have to allow gay leaders, and I mean, regardless of your position on it, it doesn't make logical sense. It's like it doesn't make sense to have because a lot of girls are basically fully formed women in their early teenage years.
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
they have boobs, they have that kind of thing.
So
So it's
it's
natural for
ridiculous.
adult males to be attracted to them.
Yeah, and if you have
So
homosexual men, they're obviously going to be have they're going to have to inevitably you're going to have situations where they're going to have to deal with how am I going to resist the attractiveness that I have to certain grown-up scouts? Yeah, it's just it's a mess. It's a complete
no,
mess.
like I'm just saying in the context of if we
Yeah,
want to get like talk about males on females, you shouldn't put like adult males watching over, especially if it's in like camp and that kind of
right.
things, uh, with like teenage girls. Like it's just you shouldn't. And this is something
Yeah.
that like
So
people understood for most of history.
yeah.
It's and I think that was a big issue with the church because there are a lot of boys who are involved with the church, and my understanding is that is to encourage discernment at a young age, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, well, that is very much the reason, since the priesthood is, you know,
Because that's
exclusively.
the idea of altar boys, right?
Yeah, that was the purpose of altar boys was to uh, encourage them to more easily discern whether or not the priesthood is for them, you know, and that's why you shouldn't have altar girls because uh, they're going to it's either going to do one or two things. It's going to uh, repel the boys because they don't want to get involved in this female pageant, um,
Mm.
pageantry, or it will essentially make some of the women, uh, want to become a priest. And when they find out
I
they
think
can't
it
become a
is
priest, that's just
basically
going to.
backdoor trying to normalize the idea of female priests. Like I can't think of what else it would be, but basically
Yeah,
my
yeah,
basically kind of my point is I think before people start to talk about the entire the whole context is like I don't think historically this was that big an issue. Like I mean, obviously this happens in everything. I don't think anybody claimed that the church was infallible, nor do I think anybody claims that there hasn't always been big issues. I mean, the church is made up of people, and people are very, very flawed.
well, yeah. I mean,
And
when we say, and then when we do make the claim that the church is infallible, that is a very narrowly defined scope
sorry, I don't mean
of.
theologically. I mean in
No, I
terms of
know, I know what you meant, but like when we do, in our qualified sense, declare the
yeah.
church to be infallible, that has a very narrowly defined scope. Uh, that is reserved for rare points in church history, you know, and that's what people don't fully understand. And if you
But
look at the narrowly defined scope of declared infallibility uh, within the church history, you will find that those points do not contradict each other, and they preserve a internally coherent set of teachings and doctrines and dogmas.
so,
You know,
like, I think another, so I think just to kind of summarize this to people who are coming in now, kind of my point is the sex abuse crisis had a couple issues. First being they shut down the Inquisition. Second, there is this we have to throw open the windows to the world. We have to open up and let the air in.
as you're
And so
quoting
they
and
were just a
channeling
lot
John the
more.
23rd, aren't you?
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I'm
Yeah,
referencing.
yeah.
And so this stuff all kind of happened, and it was done during the sexual revolution
A lot of
movement and
factors
stuff.
converging. Yeah,
And you had all this stuff, and then you also had the church trying to take secular advice, which everybody took during that time period. Like
yeah. So,
schools were doing that. There was a lot of issues.
I'm
You
pretty sure they
also
were
have
required to do that too.
Yeah, you also have the problem where we just don't have the means necessarily to punish like we used to. Like I'm sure if people did
Yeah,
this like 200 years ago, they'd burn them or they'd like execute them or they'd do
something like that.
others.
Yeah,
They do something unpleasant to that, which they
you're
should.
right. The church didn't have the temporal power to actually. Uh, of course, maybe the argument would be, well, they could have just handed them over to the state. But again, you had to deal with the fact that they were also required to cater to
I
secular
think there was
psychological
also a
advice.
general breakdown of power because I
Yeah,
think a big issue is we have a lot of really bad bishops who, due to a certain extent, it's there's a lot of issues. I think a lot of it though comes down to the church thinking that if they can just signal hard enough, they can get modern society to accept them.
yeah.
Like, okay, if we can just be tolerant enough, then people will stop attacking
We
us.
could
If we
just
can
have
just,
enough clown masses, if
yeah, if we
that's
can
what
just
we're
do
missing.
enough
We
of
don't
that.
have enough clown masses. I think that's what we're missing. If we
But
could
yeah,
just have
because
enough, 60-year-old baby boomer women at the altar, if we could just have more of those, then we'd be all set.
and to I think a certain extent, and I mean I'm kind of jumping all over here, but I think when a young male goes and they're trying to find God and they see this stuff, they're just
Yeah.
like what is this?
Well,
I want something. Yeah.
that's why a lot of Catholics are driven to orthodoxy because they see the appearances of orthodoxy, and the appearances of orthodoxy are still very much intact with its traditional roots. The appearances, liturgical appearances, are still very much in continuity with what they've always been before. And so it's very easy to get sidetracked on the appearances, which are not very good in the Catholic Church right now, uh, and not take a few moments to step back and say, okay, well, wait, what is actually true and what is actually false? So can we actually hold on to the truth despite the appearances not reflecting the truth?
So someone's asking why the Orthodox Church didn't have the same issues. I think the Greek Orthodox Church doesn't it?
I'm not entirely sure on that.
But my explanation would
Yeah,
be that I've heard it described because communism ran Eastern Europe so poorly, it happened to have the impact of just freezing it in place for like 70 years. And it just things didn't change because of that. And I'm sure you'll eventually start to see the same issues.
yeah. I mean, I think it's very difficult to look for one distinguishing factor when you're comparing the East from the West. I mean, they're very different political structures as well, right? That that are into play
Because I think that the East
that
underwent a lot
have
of like
conditioned.
political and
Yeah.
physical persecution, but it didn't have to exist in the environment of the sexual revolution and all that kind of
Right,
stuff.
exactly. Very different political social movements going in on the West versus the East at that time. That I think account for uh, the different trajectories in that area.
Yeah, because I don't know. I think it's just very fundamentally different environments, and you would kind of maybe have to look at what orthodoxy is in the West, and in particular what
Yeah.
different environments. But I don't know. I think it's going to face the same issue. My understanding is the Maronite Church, because of a issue with Notice Me Senpai, is now one of the more liberal rights.
Well, I mean, people. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that uh, because a lot of people try to attack Catholicism as in its sexual teaching, specifically on marriage, deteriorating with Pope Francis. But isn't it true that in Orthodoxy, you already that even if we were to go with Pope Francis's novel interpretation of divorce and remarriage, it would still be more conservative than the Orthodox position on divorce and remarriage.
Right, because don't they allow 3 divorces?
I think they allow divorce and remarriage in specific certain circumstances, and they have for
I think in the
forever. I
case
mean,
of adultery,
and
they
yeah,
allow it.
I think that's how they interpret. If I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that might be how they interpret that passage in the Gospels. Because a lot of people do interpret it that way,
Right.
when that's not the correct interpretation. But that was just a
But
brief aside about orthodoxy.
mhm. So yeah, so I kind of think just yeah, in a lot of ways, I think it's just was an inevitable response. I mean, because the church is made up of people, and people come from the society,
Yeah,
and I think it just kind of came up with that.
I mean it's kind
Oh.
of a low IQ point that they bring up about the sex abuse crisis. But I don't usually encounter it from people who actually want to have a serious argument against Catholicism.
But it's just the dissonance between the we need gay marriage, we need
It's hilarious to me. It's
acceptance,
hilarious
and then they're like, oh, but the sex abuse crisis. It's like
when it's because of your LGBT philosophy
no, it's like the idea is that we're expected to believe is that heterosexual males are naturally attracted to young boys,
yeah,
which I've
yeah,
never heard of that.
it's retarded.
Hmm. I think one of the, and I don't want to get too into this, I think it's one of the funnier things about Wodenism is that don't they think Woden is like the god of thunder? Because I find
No
that
one told us
very
about that.
sorry. No,
Nobody.
just it's just something I always find weird because they talk about like Woden's thunder or what like the hammer, like Wodenism's symbol is the hammer, even though that's Thor.
Oh, yeah.
I think the other really cringy
I
thing is non-Germanics who worship Wotan. Like, I saw like a group once. It was Spaniards for Woden.
well, what I don't understand is uh, why why should we take that up? I'm referring to the paganism. Why should we take that up when very rarely, and I don't know if you've encountered any, but I haven't really encountered any actual metaphysical arguments for paganism. All I see it as is an attempt to uh, give us some kind of social vehicle for, some brand of ethno nationalism or something of that sort. I never see it as some kind of
I don't know if I've
argument
ever
in its own
met
right. I
a
haven't
pagan
really.
who actually believes in pagan gods.
That's the problem, people, and I think people are under the mis
And I'm
are
not saying that facetiously, like as some kind
yeah.
of
Well, people are
calling it. I just literally haven't.
people are mistaken in assuming that when we advocate for Christianity, we're advocating for it as a cultural means of cohesion. Well, that's not true. We're advocating for it because we believe that it's in
Because of
accord
its
with
truth,
first principles, because of its
its truth
truthfulness and
claims.
veracity.
Yeah.
And I don't. Uh, we can argue for its veracity on its own grounds, even if the white race were to be extinguished tomorrow. We could still defend the truth of Christianity, and that's obviously not to say that ethnicity is not important, but it is to say that they're two different realms. They're two
Mhm.
different spheres of category, and they come together, of course, but they don't. Uh, they aren't. They don't. When they come together, they don't collapse as separate categories. We can still argue about, well, what is the truth of Christianity on its own grounds, um, versus what do we want to do to advance our social political causes. And those two can ally together, but we have to understand that they are in their own categories.
Well, and I think this comes back to one of the things I really like about Catholicism is I think it takes a very rational view of secularism. That you have the
Mm-hmm.
church and the state, and the state has to deal with some manners the church can't deal with or is incapable of dealing with. Because, like, for instance, I think the church has trouble making hard decisions, like on
Mm-hmm.
stuff like the refugee crisis. I don't really think the church
Yeah,
can make, in a
that's
lot of
true.
cases, pragmatic decisions that are needed.
Yeah, and if, I
Just
think
because,
the church hierarchy currently is very mistaken on those issues, but it's still it doesn't taint the fact that um, the church qua the church uh, retains its essential theology and philosophy, even if its leaders are making these very poor pragmatic judgments when it comes to the
right, but yeah, I'm just saying,
current
like, we have
crisis.
that aspect of it, but also I don't think like the church has, and I've talked about this with Sam a fair amount, has any particular insight into economics,
Mm-hmm.
like how that kind of thing works. I think it's very useful to serve as a moral
Yeah,
counterbalance,
well, it can.
and that's its
What
purpose.
when the church talks about economics, even when it talks about economics in an official kind of way, and whether it be an encyclical such as Rerum Novarum or what have you, what you can do, people make the mistake of thinking that if the Pope were to set up a desired minimum wage suggestion, right, for a particular country, does that mean that the church has spoken on the minimum wage? No. Well, what you can do is you can extract from that economic suggestion the moral principle that undergirds the official declaration, which would essentially be that you want to ensure that you don't set up a political system that is uh, grounded in economic injustice, right? Um, how that plays out prudentially and pragmatically can be left up to the economists, but they have to be governed by the moral principle of general economic justice.
Right, and I think that's kind of my
That's often very hard to do, by the way, but
yeah,
it
but
can
like
be done. You know.
but I think that's how like natural kind of organic secularism works is because we've always accepted that there's things that the state has to do for kind of the good of the people that might be considered immoral or amoral, and that's just kind of the reality of secular government. But I think the church has a
Yeah,
very important duty to be a
yeah,
counterbalance, but you can't have excessively idealized form of government.
that's true. Yeah, that's very true.
net, net
What the church helps us recognize in terms of politics is it does help us recognize that it does exclude certain political systems. Don't get me wrong. It does exclude, for example, anarchism, at least as a principled political philosophy. I think you can make an argument that you can be a Catholic and say an ANCAP, a prudential ANCAP, but not a principled ANCAP as a Catholic. As a Catholic, you have to recognize that the state is generative of the nature of man. It is an extension of man's humanity, if you will, and for that reason, it has goodness of its nature. But you could also make a prudential argument that, well, has human society corrupted and degenerated to the point where you don't want to afford the state any kind of power when it's constitutive of degenerated human beings that are outside of grace. I think that's an argument you can make, but it's a prudential argument. So I don't think you can be a principled ANCAP. Just as an example, the church does have something to say about politics, but that's primarily in the realm of political philosophy, not necessarily in these kinds of pragmatic, prudential.
Right, which is, I think, something I like about Christianity, like, say, as opposed to Islam, is Christianity doesn't specify a governmental system.
Yeah, right. It doesn't. It's able to. I mean, I think Christianity. I think an implication of Christianity is that monarchy is, in some respect, ideal. I don't think you can accept Christianity and argue that democracy is, and a democratic republic even, is the ideal form of government. But what it can do is it can live comfortably in different political systems, whereas Islam cannot do that.
Well, I think the purpose is more to try to have a society that is kind of built around and embodies Christian principles.
Yeah.
But how that's actually carried out, I think there's a lot of openness into what is the culture, what are the people like?
Yeah, Christianity,
what works.
Christianity can accept different forms of government as good in themselves, even if it has a preferred hierarchy of what's better, what's less ideal, but it can still accept different forms of government as legitimate in themselves. Like, for example, even the American system, the church can accept that as a legitimate form of government. Whereas I don't think that Islam, by and large, has that flexibility.
No, because
really
Islam,
it doesn't.
Because the Quran is basically a constitutional government, more or less.
Yeah,
it has
whereas Christianity makes a sharp distinction between revealed faith and natural man's nature and grace. It makes that distinction, and it affords nature its own integrity of itself, and grace perfects nature, but it doesn't. It doesn't extinguish the good of nature. The good of nature can still function without grace. That's why it's flexible.
Right, which is, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah, it is a good thing.
Let me see. Let me just glance at the chat here. Catholic social teaching is a mess. It is. I actually really like. What is it? The 5 original principles of it. I actually really like them. It's just the term is a complete kind of dumpster fire. Would you agree?
What was this exactly?
Catholic social teaching.
Oh, Catholic social teaching. I think Catholic social teaching is. I think people make the mistake of either putting too much magisterial weight in Catholic social teaching or too little magisterial weight in Catholic social teaching. People who want to completely disregard it as just mere ecclesiastical suggestions, I think, are mistaken. But also people who think that if you disagree with anything in Rerum Novarum, then you're somehow a heretic. I think that's wrong too. I think you have to do a lot of legwork in extracting the moral principles in which the church has a say from the merely economic, and that's often very hard to do. And I can't say I've done it completely, but you do have to toe that kind of what's the phrase that's used now? Big brain centrism. There is that kind of element in my point about Catholic social teaching.
Right. So, sorry, just referring to something in the chat where I think someone's basically saying that we're not, just in general, of us are very willing to have, if nothing, one of the things that attract me to Catholicism is the willingness to address questions. I don't think there's any fear of not being able to come up with intellectual answers
Well, I
to
mean, if you look at
questions. It's just that wasn't.
the Summa Theologia of Thomas Aquinas is nothing but questions and answers. You
Mhm.
know, it's a Q&A. That's the whole Summa Theologia. That's pretty much all of medieval scholasticism, if you really boil it down. The medieval intellectual tradition of the Catholic
I've
Church
never seen a
is a very
priest.
elongated Q&A session. You know, that's kind of what the Catholic intellectual life is a Q&A session. So, you know.
I don't think I've ever seen like a priest or Catholic philosopher saying you're not allowed to ask that question. I've even seen them say, I'm not really sure,
Yeah,
or it's just not something I think that can be answered, which I don't really think is the same thing as
right. Yeah.
like, because I don't know, there's lots of stuff I don't know that I'm okay saying. I just don't
Well,
know,
yeah, well,
but
like for example, in the Catholic Church, you know, a lot of Protestants will uh, anathematize you if you don't accept like everything in the Calvinistic tulip doctrine, right? They'll anathematize you if you have very uh, fine disagreements regarding the nature of grace. In the Catholic Church, there's actually a very wide spectrum of disagreement you can have on that question. You can be a Thomist on the question. You can be a Molinist on the question of grace. You know, you can accept some kind of blending of the two. You can be an Augustinian on the question of grace. There's a lot of openness uh, in Catholic theology that I think people don't. People think, oh, because they have papal infallibility, that means there's no room for intellectual freedom. There's actually a lot of room for intellectual freedom,
well,
but
I'm
you do have
basically
to.
a Catholic Neoplatonist in most ways.
Yeah, well, uh, I think if you're a Christian who doesn't have some kind of Neoplatonism in you, you really have to rethink
That's
your
just kind of
faith.
the way I
You know,
really
right?
perceive it, but it's like there's all kinds of different perspectives, and I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
in
for example,
general
yeah,
take the position that if people, it's better to have questions asked and to try to like respond to them than to just cover it up or whatever.
yeah,
That
yeah.
kind of. And I think that is, I think apologetics is gradually getting better again because I think it went through a really long dark period.
It went through a really awful period, to be honest with you. I don't know what specific kind of apologetics you're talking about. But from my own experience, I've
Just
spent most of
any.
the time in like Christian versus atheist apologetics, and that has been just abysmal for a
That
very
was
long
a
time. I
dumpster
mean,
fire. Well, because the Christian apologetics were awful, and so is the atheist.
they were awful. They were
Like they
really terrible.
couldn't. Like I've had discussions, and I actually find it hard to even have discussions with the
They're
atheists some of
still
the
not very
times
good. Yeah.
because, like, not because I can't. It's just their fundamental perception is so just weird.
Well,
I find
it's very interesting because the leading Christian apologists that would battle these atheists, they almost universally had a view of God that is a minority position across the entire
right.
history of Christian uh, thought. I mean, because my own uh, YouTube name, classical theist. Well, what does that refer to? It refers to the distinction between classical theism on the one hand, which views God as pure being, ultimately metaphysically ultimate, absolutely simple, uh, versus theistic personalism, which sees
Well,
God as kind of a
theism really
divine
has nothing
watchmaker.
fundamentally to do with Christianity, right? Like, because, like, even if the Bible was, I don't know, we found some evidence that completely disproved it in any way that God's not real.
Yeah,
Those are two completely different
yeah.
issues, which is, I think, kind of part of what you're getting at is they can't get because we had a for God largely as we'd understand him prior to modern Christianity. I mean, Neoplatonists even had a conception of a Trinity that is in some ways
That's
kind
very
of
true. Yeah,
similar.
you
Yeah,
had they got it from the idea that the good was intrinsically self-diffusive. It would intrinsically communicates itself. And for that reason, it would ultimately communicate itself in its entirety. And that's how you kind of can get at the Trinitarian dynamic of
Right, because you
the
have
good.
the logos,
Right.
the demiurge,
And the
and the
Neoplatonists,
one.
right, and the word soul. Uh, the, the,
Right,
the, the,
the world's, yeah.
they would, the new, that the Neoplatonists, I think, focused on God primarily as the good, whereas Thomism, I think rightly, shifts it from the good to the plenitude of being itself. Because even Plotinus would say that God is even the one is even beyond being. And I think St. Thomas would help us see that, well, actually, if you said that God is beyond, the one is beyond being, then that essentially would collapse him into non being.
Although when you get to stuff like that, I wonder how much of that is just a semantic or a semantic
It's,
issue.
I think it's kind of important to recognize uh, God as the unqualified, pure active being, because that I think immediately dispels the a whole host of atheist critiques against theism itself, because a lot of them are
Right,
predicated
because
on thinking of God as some individuated entity that is a being that is like us, but just maximally perfected in every sense. But it's on the same plane of existence, same plane of being, so to speak. Whereas I think classical theism very rightly sees God's being as not merely different than the being of creatures of degree, but in category, in fundamental category.
to a certain
And
extent, I think though that humans are the most categorically similar thing other than angels.
no, I think you hit the nail on the head right there, because what the human being is essentially you and I think even atheists like Neil deGrasse Tyson point this out, or at least they hint at it. The human being is in a way a summation of the whole universe, right? Human beings act as a mineral, as the minerals. We also act as the vegetable, right?
Right.
We also act as the animal, and we also act as the angel with our reason. So you have the summation of all hierarchies of being in one substance. So, what would be the best way for God to communicate himself or to bestow perfection to the universe in the most maximal way? I think it would be to unite himself to all of these hierarchies of being in one reality. And I think that would be Christ, where you have Christ, who is all those, who is the summation of the universe in his human nature and the divine nature absolutely united.
Well, because I do see in kind of my Neoplatonist sense that
Yeah,
like the God is kind of the Platonic form of consciousness and intellect and stuff, and we
yeah,
do share in that in a way that
we do.
say a
Yeah,
rock wouldn't.
yeah, and I think that goes to show the uniqueness of humanity and the whole. And that's the thing. Like a lot of atheists will say, "Well, why do you think humanity is so special?" Well, it's because humanity is, again, as I said, a summation of the whole universe, of all universal grades of being, where you have rationality, animality,
Honestly, I
sensitivity,
find it hard to believe when atheists
corporeal.
make that point that they
Yeah,
actually are like, oh, what is different between humans and other? I just even when
it's
I was like non-religious, that just seemed absurd to me.
well, I mean, for the life of me, I don't understand how they get off thinking that it's just somehow a given that the the intellect is simply reducible to mechanical particles in motion. I mean, that is a very controversial idea that they're trying to put forward. Very anti-commonsensical too. I think you can fully defend the immateriality of the intellect just by reason alone, but commonsensically, it's obvious
Also,
that
well, and I had a really good philosophy professor in university who
yeah,
really played up the idea of common sense and that your experience is not something that is to be shunned. Because, like, when we were talking about hard determinism, he said if you hit somebody, they will innately blame you for it.
Yeah.
It's just he's like, or with regards to time, you experience it, you experience these things, and to say, well, I don't feel like my actions are completely predetermined, or it doesn't feel like I'm the only thing in existence, is unfairly derided
I
as.
think Daniel Dennett made this claim. It was Daniel Dennett or something. He's made the astonishing point. He said, "There's no evidence for consciousness," and it's beguiles the mind. I mean, it's
But
just
there is like it's stupid. I've seen them say numbers don't exist.
yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's this atheistic philosopher, Alex Rosenberg, and he has this book called An Atheist's Guide to Reality, and essentially he's forced to, and he fully embraces this, by the way. He rejects all abstract thought uh, as useful fictions. So essentially, he denies the concept of abstract thought as a category of reality. He
Right.
he doesn't even he will not even concede that words that are words are communication is can be meaningful. It can convey meaning. He doesn't believe in the concept of conveying intelligible meaning at all. And it's just I like Alex Rosenberg because it's a great way to show where you have to end up when you reject
Like
the
one of
metaphysical.
the craziest things is this whole because I remember they talked about this a lot, that people can't meaningfully communicate with one another because the meaning of words is completely subjective,
Yeah,
or the meaning
and
but
I think
it's
that's helpful because it's a good argument for me to destroy nominalism. The idea that abstract abstract universal concepts don't have
okay, but
reality
if
of
that's
themselves.
true, then people couldn't build things like airplanes.
Hmm.
Like it's just, then society would not be able, like, it's to function if it wasn't. I understand it's flawed, but the truth of the matter is, if that was completely true, just any type of information could not be conveyed in a reliable manner, and nothing would work.
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't have general agreement on what color is. You wouldn't have general agreement on,
Yeah.
like, how to
Well,
build a car. It
there's
wouldn't be
also this.
replicatable.
There's also kind of the infinite regress problem with that, because if you start with the proposition that there is no shared universal, intelligible meaning between concepts that are communicated from one subject to another, and it's all uh, tethered to individual subjects, then you would have to test that to the concept of subjectivity itself. What is a subject? How can we have this conversation about subjectivity itself? And so you'd have to. It's self-refuting, is the point I'm getting at. You can't. In trying to make that argument, you already refuted the position.
Well, it was kind of, I think, and we learned about this. It was really a rejection of kind of structuralism and modernism.
Mm-hmm.
Just the idea that you could understand absolutely everything through science, but it kind of just addressed it in a really poor way.
Yeah.
Because I remember I had a really good, like I said, philosophy professor who really, really hated postmodernism, and he yelled about, like, constructing your own death, like
Mm-hmm.
socially constructing your own death. Like somebody's just walking along, and, like, a brick or something falls on him from a second floor, and he dies because he actively socially constructed his own death. And he
Yeah.
was like, that was kind of the logical conclusion of it. And I think there was some value to postmodernism, mainly in terms of, like, self-reflexivity, kind of
Yeah.
looking at
I think
tropes,
one thing
literary
it
analysis, that kind of thing.
yeah one thing it might help with it is and I'm not talking about the nihilistic variants of postmodernism, but what it kind of does is, kind of in a way, breaks the logjam of modernism itself.
Yeah.
Modern philosophy, and I think it helps to recognize, kind of break these. Cartesian Kantian uh, premises that are largely kind of taken for granted.
Hmm.
And I think it's kind of helpful with breaking down modern philosophy to kind of give more breathing room for more ancient and medieval systems too.
I also just I do like the self-reflective aspect of it, like trying to get
Yeah.
into your motivations, trying to see kind of what are the cultural and psychological issues behind things.
Hmm.
I just don't think that makes it like it fake, which I think is kind of a conclusion they jump to. They also don't accept
Right.
that people can have multiple motivations for doing things. I think is kind of
Right.
another big issue. And in general, I think if you're smart, you have multiple motivations for doing things.
Hmm.
Like, I guess it's kind of just a side point, but it's just something that always irritates me. Like, oh, well, you're doing that because it's helping you some other area. But if you're smart, you try to do something that is both moral and helps you out in a pragmatic sense. But the kind of, yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm kind of,
Yeah. Well, I get what you're saying.
but no, it's so like I said, I was very fortunate to have a good philosophy professor. He also was
Yeah,
very
I
good
think
on
it's
the
good
whole
too.
topic of the self.
Uh-huh.
Just while we're on this, just kind of to pick your brain a bit, does the are you familiar with the four main categories of free will theory?
Free will is an issue I haven't gotten in too much. It's particularly with the modern literature on it. Um, I spend way too much time looking into mystics sources on these questions that I
Well, just
kind
because
of
I
lose
find it
sight on the
interesting.
contemporary debate.
So, like the four major ones are hard determinism, which I think is pretty
Right, yeah, and
straightforward.
then they have compatibilism with that.
Compatibilism, libertarianism,
Yeah, yeah,
and hard incompatibilism. No, sorry, hard indeterminism, which
yeah.
frankly scares the shit out of me.
Right.
That
Yeah.
the universe is just completely random. But I actually kind of tend towards libertarianism myself.
Hmm. I, I,
Uh,
th- I think uh,
does the Catholic Church have any position on that kind of thing?
it would definitely reject a hard determinism, um, because it rejects it placing some value in the free deliberation of the will is an essential part of Catholic moral theology, right? Where
Right.
if you do have to concede the ability of the will to deliberate this from that of itself, and not be completely conditioned by physical material forces that would compel it to one good or one object versus another. Um, I think there's definitely room for there's definitely room for compatibilism in Catholic thinking on the issue, without a
Just
doubt.
because kind of my view of the whole question is I think it's kind of it's very misunderstood.
Yeah.
I think what free will is, and I kind of view this in an Aristotelian thing. What free will is the ability to start causal chains
Mm,
through intentionality, because you have kind of Aristotle's old thing. The rock is moved by the staff, which is moved by the hand, which is moved by the man,
right.
and you just logically don't need to go back further than that.
Right. It
Uh,
the source is in the intentionality essentially.
right, and I think
Causal
that also
source. Yeah.
kind of
I,
refers
I
to how
think
God made the
yeah.
universe.
Well, it's also the fact that if you concede the immateriality of the intellect, um, then you realize that if the intellect is in a sense above specific concrete material objects,
Mhm.
um, then it has that uh, natural ability to survey this good versus that other good and direct the will toward one that freedom that freedom from being compelled by material forces, such as, say, the passions, for example.
Because to
Of
take
course,
the traditional definitions are things like the freedom to do otherwise, but I
yep.
think it's nonsensical because people you wouldn't do otherwise with because you're acting in your nature. So
Hmm.
it's like you could have killed that little girl. That was like but you wouldn't have. Like, okay, so you chose not to kill like some random kid you see.
Right.
It's like, well,
Well,
free will is the freedom to do
yeah.
otherwise, but you just wouldn't do that because it's against your nature.
Well, and in a way, not doing that, um, or choosing to do that, would be, uh, just deciding to kill that little girl. I can't say that as anything other than being compelled by the passions, right? Being compelled by one's animalistic passions, versus uh, living virtuously is the intellect being transcendent of these material passions, and directing the will toward what the intellect can perceive as good, as restrained by these passions. And
Right.
I think that's essentially what the Thomistic idea of freedom is, since the will proceeds from the intellect, and the intellect is ideally uh, unchained by these kinds of concupiscible passions,
But I
that
don't
would
know. At
weigh
the
it
same
down.
time, like it's. I think in the kind of the general definition of free will that we have at the moment is like the freedom to make decisions without being predisposed by something.
Yeah,
But
well,
once
that's
again,
definitely the commonplace idea of it. But I think you have to. It's much better to understand the freedom of the will as it relates to the uh, the nature of the intellect as
I just think it's
transcendent
something
of.
that conscious beings inherently possess, regardless
Right,
of yeah.
right, yeah. Because if you start from the perspective of the intellect, you realize that the intellect is what can survey various objects of the appetite, uh, and then decide which is truly good as a fulfillment of the appetite and which is not, and then the will, as derivative of the intellect, will make that determination. Um,
Mm,
but again, that's unchanged from the material world, so it's freedom in that sense, as being uh, unchained from the weight of the passions.
right. So we covered a bunch of stuff. Let me just maybe we'll take a couple questions from the chat. Let me just give me 1 second. Let's see what are people asking about. I think there was some long thing that was going on while I was talking about that. Let's see here. Existentialism is really bizarre. Preach them IRL. Let's see here. Superior intellect. Imperial Aspirations is saying he doesn't like Thomism.
He doesn't what Thomism?
Doesn't like Thomism.
Well, I mean that's understandable. I mean, I understand why a lot of people don't like. I mean, it depends on what perspective you're coming from, though. I mean, because a lot of people don't like Thomism from a Palamite Orthodox perspective. A lot of people don't
I
like
think it's an
Thomism.
Orthodox perspective. I
Well,
just
yeah,
assumed that.
I think that's actually interestingly, and that kind of surprised me. That's where most of the hatred of Thomism comes from. Is from not from atheists, not because most atheists don't know about Thomism, but not from Protestants even, but from the Orthodox, and then that confuses me sometimes. I mean, I understand that the disagreements between Thomism and Palaminism, but the
Mm-hmm.
visceral hatred that they have of Thomism is very interesting to me. Because I don't know if do you know about David Bentley Hart versus
No.
David Bentley Hart is this Orthodox philosopher, theologian. I like a lot of what he says on classical theism,
Mm-hmm.
and then Edward Fraser is uh, a Catholic philosopher, Thomist, and he talks a lot about classical theism too. So they're kind of united on that front. But so I thought they would be natural allies in that regard. but they're actually it's very interesting because David Bentley Hart, from his Orthodox perspective, hates Thomism, and because of his hatred of Thomism, he therefore has this kind of animosity toward Edward Fraser. So that's kind of like a manifestation of the thing that I'm kind of talking about. It's just interesting to me that they have this hatred of Thomism. Yeah, but I get why they don't like it, but just the visceral nature of the distaste for it is noteworthy to me.
Okay, maybe I'll take one or two more. Just if anybody has any like really juicy questions, please post them in the chat. Let's see, divine simplicity.
Thomas used divine simplicity to render the manifestation of Christ completely incoherent. Well, I mean, you'd have to give a specific reason why absolute divine simplicity is incompatible with the hypostatic union. I don't. I mean, I understand. Well, on its face, why people would say that, but I would need a concrete reason, to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and let's first say David Bentley Hart helped me away from atheism. Yeah, I mean he's very good on that subject. I think he's very good on the subject of introducing people to classical theism and getting them away from these William Lane Craig kind of ideas of God that are popularized in Protestant apologetics. I think he's very good for that, and I think he's continues to be valuable on that front.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this opinion on scientific contests. That's a very interesting issue. You want to tackle that one at all?
I'm not probably as familiar as it with you, so go ahead.
Scientific conteism, I think, is predicated on the idea that the Pope loses his office as Pope if he falls into formal heresy. A formal heresy essentially is distinguished from material heresy as essentially being that you're a formal heretic if you deny a Catholic teaching willingly versus a material heretic if you deny a Catholic teaching without knowing that it's the Catholic teaching. So they would say that if you fall into formal heresy, you essentially sever yourself from the church, incur automatic excommunication on yourself. If the Pope does that, how can he be the head over that of which he's not actually a member if he's a formal heretic, right? So they would say that if a Pope does that, then he's no longer the Pope by that kind of logic. I think it's wrong because I don't see how simply being automatically excommunicated by virtue of formal heresy would render you somehow utterly incapable of keeping the office of the papacy. I think it could come about to where you would incur automatic excommunication and would, by that reason, await the formal declaration of excommunication by the actual hierarchy. But until that happens, I think it's reasonable to think that you would have your papal jurisdiction supplied for you for the sake of the faithful. Because how are they supposed to know if you're a formal heretic? So I think it's wrong. For Francis could be a quote unquote in the sense that what he says may not be in accord with Catholic teaching, but to say that he's a formal heretic, you would need to know if he's willingly departing from it. And if he is, then I think and I think it would be incumbent upon a college of bishops to remove him. It wouldn't happen automatically.
So, anyways, I think that's probably good. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up? Oh, just one more thing. So, I'll post another link. So, everybody, please go subscribe to Classical Theist Channel. Like I said, he's a really smart guy, a really great guy, personally speaking. And he's going to continue to put out excellent content.
A lot of anti-atheist content I'm going to put out soon.
Yep.
But So
So, anyways, thanks for coming on.
yeah, I
Have a
appreciate it.
good rest of the
I really
Sunday.
appreciate it. Yeah, you too, man.
Okay. Bye, everybody.